So we pray. Holy and gracious God, thank you for this opportunity to gather together, to learn, to lunch, to share conversation, and to be really good stewards of this planet, this place, all the many resources and gifts that you have given us. With all those things, with gratitude and thanks, we praise your name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, now can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're right in the middle of the...
Well, we're doing a little introduction now. Yeah, okay. So, as you have been informed, and you probably know, our speaker today is Guy Schultzman, a member here at Good Shepherd. And he says, I am a mechanical engineer, so that's why he knows all this stuff. And through his whole career, spanned 38 years, he was at Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory in New York State. And he worked in a variety of roles associated with the operation, maintenance, and dismantlement of the Navy.
It went off. Doink it.
It's blinking.
There, no, the light's on.
Now it's on. Anyway, the operation, maintenance, and dismantlement of the naval nuclear power plants. It's pretty tough stuff. Wasn't that near 3 Mile Island?
No.
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 Okay.
Nothing associated.
You weren't about it. Okay. All right. His wife Barbara and he relocated to Washington, Utah, I would assume during the time of your retirement.
Correct.
In 2013, and they've been members of Good Shepherd since 2014, at which time he became a member of the Buildings and Grounds Committee for life. So if you're warm, thank Guy. If you're chilly, complain to him. So this is the guy behind the button. So welcome, Guy. Glad to have you here today.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Turn this on. So as I was graciously introduced, I have been involved in many of the modifications that have been done over the past 8 years at Good Shepherd's Church in order to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings. And part of my presentation will talk to you about that process. But as a way of introducing that, I just wanted to go through some basics which many of you may be familiar with, but they're clearly applicable to all facilities, not only the church, but also your individual homes. And as a result, you may have some appreciation for that at a local level. First of all, I wanted to talk to you about some terms, and they can be very confusing, especially the way America refers to scientific types of terms. Of course, electrical energy, which you may be quite familiar with, deals with amps and volts. Kilowatts is your energy term, and kilowatt hours is total power, meaning how much energy you have used over time. One of the other terms that's particularly applicable here at our church, but not in your own individual residence, is electrical demand. And that, the church gets charged in electrical demand for how much power it uses over the maximum 15-minute time period in a day. And we get charged more for the highest level of power draw that we have in that time period as part of the bill. So not only how much power do you use, which all residential customers do, but how fast do you use it. And that's important to the church because we had 7 air conditioners at one time. And if all 7 operating, we were drawing more electricity than we were authorized based upon our classification as a customer with St. George Power. Something else that you hear with air conditioning is the term tons of air conditioning. That's kind of an unusual America-only term. And it really refers to, historically, the equivalent cooling capacity of 1 ton of ice. That's where it has its origin from. It is equivalent to BTUs per hour, which is the typical way we refer to heating capacity. So the term ton refers to refrigeration. BTUs per hour is the typical term that we use when we're referring to heating capacity. Both of them refer to the ability to add or remove energy. And a ton of air conditioning is equivalent to 12,000 BTUs per hour. Another term that you hear about when you talk about energy efficiency is the R value. And that's the resistance to the conduction of energy by a substance. So oftentimes when we talk about the insulation that may be in the walls or in the ceiling, you'll hear the term R value. And for example, one of the upgrades that we went through with the church, as I'll discuss later, is we increased the amount of insulation that's in the ceilings, in the attic, in the ceilings. Typical R values in our area that are recommended are above 30. Part of the effort of the church over the past several years, we rose the R values up to 45 in all of our buildings. But they were quite low when we started. Another term that is often used, particularly when we're talking about various areas of the country, is heating degree days and cooling degree days. Now, that refers to the number of days that are above or below a certain temperature. And a heating degree day is one that is below an average temperature of 60 degrees. Meaning that if it's below 60 degrees, we typically need heating, and the number of days that the temperature is below that level on an average basis represents the type of capacity the community needs in order to heat. Likewise, cooling degree days is just the opposite, but for cooling. And if the average temperature for a day was 85 degrees, it would represent about 20 cooling degree days. So you multiply the average temperature times the number of days, you get the cooling degree days. And once again, that gives you a good baseline for trying to understand how the climate is driving the air conditioning and heating needs in the local community. Another typical term that may be obvious is delta T. That's just the shorthand reference to the difference in temperature between two objects, or two ranges. Another heating term that may need some explanation is MERV, minimum efficiency reporting value. That's the measurement for air filters. So you all have air filters in your home. We maintain them in here also. The typical MERV value for an air filter is around 8, but a high efficiency filter is 12 or 13. Obviously, you pay more for a higher quality filter. And the last term that you ought to be familiar with is natural circulation. And that's circulation that is driven by a natural difference in temperature. So hot air rises, that works to your benefit in the attic, for example, and provided you have adequate ventilation. As long as you have an exhaust port and a port that's lower, you get natural circulation in your attic. As the heat goes up into the attic, it draws air in and cools the attic automatically. So those are some of the terms. If any of those are not familiar to you, let's ask some questions. The next kind of basic concept is, how do we transfer heat? And what are the mechanisms that exist for transferring heat? There's really three basic mechanisms that exist: conduction, convection, and radiation. Now, I highlight conduction and convection because those are the most important mechanisms for heat transfer for a building, such as your home or this church. But another major method is radiation if the temperature is very high. So what's conduction? Conduction is the transfer of heat without movement within a material. And so these walls are consisted of plasterboard, 2x4s, insulation in between, and some sheathing on the outside. There's no movement of material as heat is transferred through this wall. It's all dependent upon the resistance of the individual components to that. So one method of heat transfer is conduction, meaning the inside of the wall in winter is warmer than the outside, and heat is transferred without movement of any material through the wall, dependent upon the resistance of the components. That's conduction. It requires physical contact. Different materials have different effectiveness for heat transfer. Copper is a good component for transferring heat. Styrofoam is not. And it's proportional to the temperature difference, or the delta T. The larger the difference in temperature, the more heat is transferred. Convection is the next method that's important to us for buildings. And that's the transfer of heat by fluid motion. And that fluid may be gas or liquid. So it's dependent on the mass transfer of a fluid medium. Think about when you're drying your hair, for example. You're actually blowing air through your hair to pick up moisture and to warm the hair. That's the movement of heat borne by the air that is passed over your head. Liquid transfers are much more efficient than gas. Think about the fact that when you're in water, water feels colder typically than the air because it carries the heat away, and the movement of the water against your skin cools you very effectively. Once again, convection is proportional to the delta T, meaning the difference in temperature. The greater the difference in temperature, the more aggressive the motion of the fluid that is drawing the heat away. The third typical engineering method of heat transfer is radiation. It requires no medium in order to affect the transfer. It's how the sun heats the earth. Even though we're going through physical contact, there's no motion of a solid, but the radiation that is occurring from the sun or from a heat lamp, for example, draws away energy and deposits it. It is dominant at very high temperatures. Actually, it's proportional to the fourth power of the absolute temperature. And so the surface of the sun's about 10,000 degrees. That's what drives the heat transfer to the earth. But it's kind of negligible at room temperatures. You'll see some insulation, household insulation, that claims that it has radiant heat restricting capabilities. But that's such a small portion of the heat transfer at normal operating temperatures that it's not even worth paying for. Wanted to talk about some of the examples of each one of those, of the two dominant means of heat transfer that occurs within our building. And I've already mentioned one of them, and that being the heat transfer of energy through a wall, a window, or a door. So that's an example of conduction. The temperature on the inside is higher or lower than the temperature on the outside. You don't have any flow of a mass or a gas, but you lose energy through the wall dependent upon its resistance to the transfer. Likewise, we lose energy to the earth, and you also transfer energy to your attic through the ceiling. All examples of conduction. Convection, though, is the transfer of energy as a result of a fluid motion. And an example of that is the operation of a heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system itself. For example, most of us have a forced air system for your home. Those are the systems that we have here at the church also. And we use convection as a means of equalizing the temperature, adding heat or removing heat in the summer. And so a forced air system circulates air. It comes in, draws heat in through these vents here. It either conditions that air and then discharges them to overhead vents here and here. And it's that transfer of energy through a convective means that allows you to feel warm in the house or the room. Another example of that would be air leakage through doors or windows, and actually the natural circulation of airflow through a room. An example of convection, many of us have ceiling fans in our home that we use to circulate air within a particular room. Once again, that's a way of using convective heat transfer in order to equalize the temperature within a room. And the transfer of heat from the attic to the atmosphere is also a method of heat transfer through convection. And I'll show you that as a diagram a little bit later. Any questions on that? So, yeah.
On the ceiling fan. So in the winter, you want the ceiling fan to push the air down?
Traditionally, what I've seen is that during winter, you discharge up to the ceiling and cause a circulation down this way. And in summer, you reverse it because you also benefit from the feeling of a breeze onto your body. And so you reverse the direction. That's typically what I've seen. I don't do that at home, too hard to reach. So I can't change the direction. I just leave it in one direction all year round. And you're still getting mixing of the air. And so you'll tend to dissipate the natural change in temperature from the floor to the ceiling by operating it. So how do we condition our air? Well, we do it by obviously heating in winter and cooling in summer. And in this particular area, for heating, the most common method is a gas furnace of some sort. I also lived for a long period of time in the East, and at one time we had a fuel oil forced air furnace, and I'd get deliveries of oil, which would be retained in the basement, and we would consume that. The other method of heating that is gaining in popularity are heat pumps. And heat pumps operate similar to an air conditioner, where it uses electrical power and a working fluid in order to transfer energy, either in or out. And that's what a heat pump can do. So even though the temperature is colder outside, a heat pump is able to draw energy from the outside and pump it into the inside and actually warm an interior space. Now, it's gaining popularity simply because it uses electricity. And electricity, as provided by your local supplier, can be supplied through methods that don't burn carbon fuel. And that would be solar or wind energy that the utility provides to you. So heat pumps offer a method of providing heat in climates that are cold and still don't burn carbon-based fuel as a means of getting that energy, which is good for the environment. Now, how do we cool in the summer? Well, the traditional means is an air conditioner. It uses a working fluid in a closed system and allows you to transfer energy up a thermal incline. And so we can cool a space that is hot, even though we're trying to transfer energy from one space to another up a higher temperature level. And it uses electricity as the means. A couple of other means, and one that is particularly effective in our area, is evaporative coolers. Now, an evaporative cooler uses water and the latent heat of evaporation of water in order to cool air. So if you have water going through a filter and you draw warm air over it, the air will naturally be cooled because it is absorbing energy as you evaporate the water into it. Adds humidity and it cools the air in that process. So climates that are hot and dry can use evaporative cooling very effectively as a way of cooling your home. And this particular area could benefit much from evaporative cooling. It's also fairly inexpensive because all you're paying for is the water and also running a fan, which is much less expensive than running an air conditioning compressor. The other way of cooling in summer is something called whole house ventilation, and that simply uses the fact that by nature, nighttime temperatures are a little bit cooler. If you draw outside air heavily into the house during nighttime, you will reduce the temperature in your house, and that'll set you up for a cool house starting during the daytime. Of course, you gotta cycle that. You gotta turn it off during the day. But that's another mechanism of cooling in summer. Predominant one that's in use now is air conditioning, and it's literally vital to us in the St. George area in summer. So we all need to condition the temperatures in our home, in our air. What do we use? What are the mechanisms that we use in order to do that? And all of us usually have a basic thermostat, which is adequate for a full-time, non-working family. And a basic thermostat is one where you can set the temperature, and it will automatically control either your air conditioner or your furnace to maintain that temperature over time. So it has a set point temperature that can be manually adjusted. You usually have to transfer between heating and cooling modes, and you can turn the fan on and off and set it to automatic operation so you can manually. Now, those are the types of thermostats that I use at my house. Kind of simple, straightforward, but we don't cycle the temperature much because we live in our house full time. The next method of controlling, at least is a programmable thermostat. And there, if the building is unoccupied for significant time periods, you can save energy costs by cycling the set point temperature based on occupancy levels. And that's what we do here at church. Many of our buildings go unoccupied during the week. And so having a fixed temperature, maintaining, for example, 72 degrees during winter, 24/7 throughout the time period would be wasteful for us. Rather, we use thermostats where you can control the temperature based upon a program throughout the week. And by doing that, we reduce the delta T that we maintain, the difference in temperature. Heat transfer is always proportional to delta T, and so you're saving energy by doing that. Typically, these will automatically shift between heating, cooling, and as required, and many of them today can be operated remotely via the internet. And that's exactly the type of thermostats that your church uses. So we have programmable thermostats in all of our buildings here. They cost a little bit more, but they provide a drastic amount of flexibility. And the last item that I wanted to mention, although none of us at home would ever use this, but it's a building management system where you're trying to manage multiple zones and equipment. All of our thermostats here at Good Shepherd Presbyterian Church are controlled through a building management system through Ecobee. And I can sit at my home computer once a week based upon the schedule that Chris prepares for the upcoming week, and I can reprogram the thermostats to come on and off based upon whether we anticipate the individual areas are going to be occupied and at what level.
That's
why
why
it-
now, Guy, we know who to blame now.
Yes, you do.
That's why it's important that if you're going to have something in one of the buildings, you let us know, otherwise you're going to be very hot or very cold.
Right.
I need to speak to you about that.
Now, the other distinct advantage that has provided to the church is the fact that it also captures the actual temperature and humidity data over a function of time. And I can go back and I can look at the performance of the heating system over the past week to ensure it's doing what we programmed it for. The other advantage that it allows us to do is to reduce electrical demand charges. Now, I mentioned electrical demand, and that's something that you don't pay for as a resident, but all commercial facilities do. And we can manage through the building management system which air conditioners can come on at what time, and a priority to them, in order to avoid multiple air conditioners running in the same 15-minute time period, which would add to our demand charges. So it's another mechanism by which the church can reduce the charges from St. George Electrical Power in an effort to manage our activities. All of that became available when we purchased the building management system. Far more complex than anyone at home needs, but certainly is an advantage to a corporate activity.
Guy,
Yeah.
how long have you had that business management system, and have you noticed good reductions in electrical use?
Yes, we have. Quite truthfully, I think we've had it since about 2019. But quite truthfully, the more important factor that we found is the fact that we don't allow local control of thermostats. There was a time period where we had locked the thermostats, and we saw that was an effective way to control the temperature. But then we got so many complaints that the building elder at that time said, let's kind of release that. And that was a mistake, because the minute we did, the electrical power costs went back up significantly. We all like to be able to adjust it finally to us, but we end up paying for it if we do.
On that basic thermostat, I've been told over time that you should always leave your fan running, on the furnace fan.
Uh-huh.
Is that true, or, in other words, it said that then it's more efficient, doesn't have to get rid of all the hot air in the ducts, and, that it's always circulating.
Well, one of the things that you have to take into account is that whenever the fan is running, you're also drawing outside air into your home. By the design of your furnace and your heating system, it's designed to operate with about 10%, 20% of outside air whenever the fans are operating, that you're drawing in. You have to condition the air that you're drawing in at the same time. So you're going to have to cool it in summer or heat it in winter. So by running the fan continuously, you're also drawing 10 to 20% of the air flow through your house continuously. Personally, I don't like that idea too much, because I'm paying to heat the external air that I'm drawing into it. Rather, I depend simply on the amount of times that it has to turn on automatically to do that. So I've heard that argument, but I personally only operate the fans in automatic unless there's a good reason to do it, just to get circulation at that time. Yeah, Kurt.
Yeah, the question I had, it goes back to that delta T. For example, in the winter, if we had a 20-degree morning, and then we knew we want to use our sanctuary on Sunday morning at a certain time, would that management system give the building longer to heat up and come up to temperature than it would on a less cold day? That's my question.
I don't believe that it does. I don't believe it takes into account the ambient temperature in making those decisions.
Okay.
It does have a preheat time period. So, for example, 1030 service. I can do that as long as I've implemented an automatic heat program within the system. And at that point, based upon past history, the program will turn on the furnace sufficiently in advance of 10:30 that by 10:30 it will be at the temperature that it's supposed to be. So there's a logic within it that tries to, preheat a room or a building in anticipation of the upcoming event. But I don't believe that it adjusts it based upon the existing
Yeah.
ambient temperature at the time.
Okay.
I don't think it's that sophisticated. So this is the typical way that a heating or air conditioning system is arranged in your home or at here. And I've mentioned a couple of times that we draw outside air at 10-20% whenever we circulate the air within the system. And that's really set in an effort to ensure that the quality of air in an enclosed space doesn't degrade over time. So it tends to refresh. The other area that it draws the air from is the actual inside of the area. So these ventilation ducts here and here are the ones where air is drawn into as it's either heated or cooled. At the same time, the air conditioning and furnace system is drawing a small amount of outside air to mix with that. So those all go through the damper, which controls the flow of air, and it'll pass through a filter to remove airborne particulate material. It goes to a fan, which supplies the motive force for the air to circulate. And it then goes to a heating coil, which changes the temperature, raises the temperature in winter. Obviously, the heating coil in summer is not operating. Rather, you're passing the air through something called an air conditioning evaporator, which cools the air. That air then goes to a distribution system, and it pushes the air back into the enclosed space through distribution dampers. And those distribution dampers look like this. Now, they'll also typically, these don't have it, but typically in your house, you'll have a way of adjusting these dampers, which means you can close down slightly on them or open them fully. And that way you can balance the flow of air.
What are those two in the front then, in the ceiling?
Those are returns.
These are inlet dampers,
Oh,
or
just
these
like-
are
just like
inlet,
these?
just
Oh,
like
okay.
these, yes.
They're returns.
Yeah. It's a little complicated here because this building was actually expanded in size at a later time. And at that time, we actually originally added an additional air conditioner to service this. So at one point in time, we had two different air conditioners that cooled Conklin Hall. Now, we have since eliminated that second air conditioner because it was truly unnecessary, and we rejoined all of the piping associated with it. But that's why you'll see a little bit of difference between this end of the building and the rest of it in that respect. Last big component in the typical air conditioning system is the air conditioner's compressor and condenser, which are located outside. And for this building, those are located in the courtyard, fenced-in courtyard right out here. So those types of components exist
is it a bad thing to close a vent, off totally in a room? Say, you're happy with where it's located, that the air's just fine, either
Yeah.
summer or winter. And so you just have a thing totally closed off. Is that not a good thing to do, or does it matter?
Kind of 6 of one and a half dozen of another, depending upon the reason you're closing it off. Obviously, when you do that, you're kind of reducing the total flow through your system. But if you have a good reason for doing so, then it's the right thing to do. At my house, I have one of those discharge vents going to a walk-in closet that we normally have closed off. And if I had normal full flow going to that closet would get very warm in winter, and fairly cool in summer, more so. All right. So I choose to close off the damper, and restrict the amount of flow going to that closed off space, just to make it more balanced throughout it. And so we're not walking into a different temperature difference as we go in and out of the closet. Now, wanted to talk a little bit about the pathways that exist within your home. And we've talked about the pathways for conduction already. You have heat transfer from your interior space to the earth. You have you have conduction transfer through the walls, and you also have conduction up through the ceiling into the enclosed attic space. And the attic space is extremely important to efficient control of temperatures, both in summer and winter, because it accumulates an awful lot of heat. In winter, obviously, heat rises, and so the amount of conduction going up into the attic is fairly large. And that's why you'll find that the largest amount of insulation in a typical home is in the attic space, in the floor of the attic. The attic itself is either cooled or heated by convection flow that comes in via the soffits, which are the low point, and leaves by high point vents. And so that's an example of convection flow. Good flow through your attic is essential for keeping your home well conditioned. And it's kind of interesting because there's few of us who go up into our attic spaces very often, but there's some unusual things that can occur. And it's important that that flow be of proper size and be allowed to function in order to minimize the energy used in our home. The other example here is the actual furnace or air conditioner that we're using. It will typically draw in fresh air in order to combust the gases and heat the air. And there's a combustion exhaust that usually is routed up through our roof. And there's forced air internal through the furnace system within your home. And so those are some of the transfer paths that you'll typically see. Now I mentioned the attic spaces because our experience here at Good Shepherd Church was quite negative in that regard. It was one of the more significant things that we had to deal with back around 2018 and 19 when we were doing a fair amount of building upgrades. In fact, it was very surprising that we had some of the issues that we did within the attic spaces, and I'll show you some pictures in that regard, to the point that in very few of our buildings, the attic ventilation was non-functional in most of our buildings. And that was adding to our energy use as a result of that. Wanted to pause for a second and talk about the typical maintenance that all of us need to do, but whether it's our home or here at our church. And there's a fair amount of maintenance that can be done by the homeowner himself without the use of a professional. And that typically involves things like filter change-outs, which I recommend at least twice a year at our homes. Use furnace filters that you'll typically replace at that point in time. Now, my furnace filters are attached in the ceiling, and so I have to get a ladder out, and bring it down, and put the new one in. I typically, for the bulk of the house, I use a MERV 7 or 8. That's kind of a general use air filter. For our bedroom, we use a high efficiency filter, mostly because that's where our pets are at also. And they sleep with my wife, etc. And so I try to circulate those and remove some of those allergens more effectively in our bedroom area. Another thing that you can do as far as homeowner measurements, we talked about a little bit, you can adjust the dampers. You want to start with your dampers wide open, and if that doesn't provide good, balanced, comfortable conditions in all of your rooms, either a room is too hot or too cold, you can adjust the damper. You can cut back on a damper if the room is too hot in winter or too cold in summer. You can cut down to reduce the conditioning in that particular room. Just allow enough time between adjustments that you allow your rooms to come to balance. The other thing I recommend doing is to check your heating and cooling effect at the start of each season. You can do that with a fairly inexpensive tool, an infrared thermometer, by measuring the temperature difference that your system is creating when it's operating. So typically an air conditioning system runs with a temperature difference between the inlet and the outlet of about 20 degrees. So when an air conditioning system is operating, you ought to be able to go and measure the temperature difference at around 20 degrees. An infrared thermometer allows you to do that. You can measure the temperature at the inlet, and it'll record that for you. And then you compare that by recording the temperature on an outlet. And it's a nice, simple tool to use. Allows you to sense that difference. You don't have to get onto a ladder. You don't have to use anything else. There are obviously times when we need professionals, though, and I do recommend that you use a good qualified professional air conditioning technician at least at the start of your air conditioning time period and a furnace check in winter. The typical thing that fails in systems, whether they're systems here at church or at your home, believe it or not, are small electrical components called capacitors that are used in helping to mitigate the high starting currents on various components. Whether that be the compressor for your air conditioning or the fans for your capacitors can degrade over time. When they do, the fan won't start, the compressor won't start. And of course, at that particular point, your heating or your air conditioner is useless, and you have to call for a technician. And typically, it's just a small component that has failed or degraded over time. Only costs about $10 to replace it. But I actually keep a stock of these starting capacitors for my system at home, and I can do that replacement typically without calling for a technician. Otherwise, furnaces are fairly reliable, and air conditioners almost as much so. So that was kind of covering the basics. I now wanted to talk a little bit about the journey that your church has gone through ever since 2017 in an effort to try to reduce the electrical or the energy uses that we've had and how we went about that process. And it started in 2017 by really a self-assessment. We looked at the type of equipment we were using, both air conditioners and furnaces. The church uses a total of 9 furnaces. 3 of them are twinned units, meaning 2 furnaces are ganged together in order to increase capacity. And as a result, you actually have to maintain the 9 furnaces. When we started out, we had a total of 7 air conditioners, separate air conditioners that were independently operating for all of our facilities. We now have 6 air conditioners because we took advantage of eliminating one of them simply because there was excess capacity. We also checked the energy use of all of the air conditioners, recognizing that in summer, half of the energy that the church used was expended for air conditioning in summer. So if you looked at the total energy over a year, half of it was summer air conditioning. The other thing that we recognized at that time when we did that study was that electrical demand was a very significant portion of our cost, and we could control that cost by controlling when the air conditioners started, trying to ensure that only a few of them operated simultaneously. We inspected our attics, and as I've alluded to before, we found multiple problems when we did that inspection. In many cases, the attic ventilation was blocked. In some cases, it was never built into the attic originally. For example, the church education building had a ridge vent that was originally constructed into it, providing excellent high point ventilation, but it had no soffit vents. So you couldn't draw air in, and that really meant that you had no ventilation within the attic at all. Now, why it has no soffit vents was a mystery. In the case of the narthex, which is part of this entire complex, we had nice soffit vents, but they were all covered with blown-in insulation and ineffective. So they were blocked. And those were just a couple of examples of the issues that we saw when dealing with that. We inspected all of the exterior doors and windows. And at that particular time, we had already, by 2017, we had already upgraded virtually most of our lighting to LEDs, and so that was a non-issue. But that was our self-assessment. But I'll point out with the next slide that We also took advantage of engaging a professional energy audit that was offered through the gas company that we do business with. Don't know if you've heard the term of thermwise. It was used by Dominion Gas at that time. It was a free service, and you're all eligible for it at home also. But they came and they did inspections. Part of that inspection measured our ductwork to actually see how much leakage was occurring as our fans operated due to leakage within the attic and the ductwork. That was identified to us to be an issue based upon their measurements. They used thermal cameras on the exterior of our buildings to measure leakage areas that represented some potential pathways. And it was all formalized in a written report, and it gave us specific recommendations. The other advantage of using that system that we actually capitalized on was they also offered rebates on a couple of things that cost us money. And so by engaging the thermwise system in advance that was offered through Dominion, we were able not only to get good recommendations that we ultimately used, we were able to report the costs to them, and they gave us money back as a result of doing that. That type of service is also available to you.
Even though it's getting rich now, does Enbridge still do that?
Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't particularly aware. I do know that the cities don't do that, but the commercial companies do. Right. So once we had done that self-assessment, the building committee took a look at all of that and kind of prioritized what we thought were the biggest hitters for the church and approached session and approved the budget. And at that time, in 2018, the items that we worked on was duct sealing of all of the attic ducting. I'll show you a picture of that. But basically, that just sealed all of the ductwork in the attic, so there was no external leakage as a result of operation of the fan that was bypassing the actual people spaces of the room. We insulated all of the attic spaces to R45, and we cleared all of the soffits so that normal attic ventilation could occur. Once again, kind of interesting. One of the toughest places to access is the attic space above the sanctuary. It's way up there, and it's hard to reach from the attic reaches. And you knew it when you got up there and you looked around, because there was only about that much blown-in insulation. Had the same situation in my own home when I went to do this, because there's a section where I can access the attic. It's very difficult to get around in the attic space of my home. When I actually hired someone to increase the number of inches of blown-in insulation, and he had to get way into the back areas, he reported back to me, Guy, there was no insulation back there. And it was just a typical construction type of shortcut that whoever insulated the home took advantage of, that no one was going to inspect that area because it was too hard to get to. So you could run into a lot of surprises. We saw them here, and I've seen them in my own home. We added additional ventilation through the roof in an effort to get the ratio of square footage to attic space what is recommended for proper flow. That also allowed us to add low point vents to the roof in the church education building where I said it had a nice high point vent, but there was no soffit vents. So in place of soffit vents, we added roof vents that are located low on the roof to serve as pathways for natural circulation. It was in 2018 that we installed the smart thermostats. That allowed programmability. We also could lock them at that time. We purchased the building management systems. And in that process, we also learned that the overall capacity that we had typically far exceeded our needs for the church. And so we had more cooling capacity, more heating capacity than we would typically need. Now that's important for our future use, because when we have to replace our air conditioning units, we know we can reduce capacity, which reduces energy draw and energy usage, because typically we don't encounter the need for the capacity that was originally built for the system. So those were the main thrusts that came out of our self-assessment. In 2019, we ended up replacing the air conditioners in the church education building, but we took advantage of the fact that we had an extra air conditioner for this building that was no longer needed. And we actually removed that air conditioner and brought it over and replaced it in the church education building for an air conditioner that was out of date and of need of replacement. That's when we went from 7 air conditioners down to 6, which we have today. We then come up to the time period when the church was actually shut down due to the COVID pandemics. And we ended up installing a purge valve and some high efficiency filters in the sanctuary area. Now the purge valve was there so that we could do a high capacity purge of the air, thinking that that would be useful after a Sunday service and setting ourselves up, recognizing that we wanted to control the quality of the air within the area. We've never used that though. We ended up not using it because we really closed the church down for almost a year and a half during that time period. And so that really wasn't necessary. We continue to use high efficiency filters, typically in the sanctuary, and at least we have the capacity within our systems to use those type of filters. In 2023 and 24, we took another look at the journey that we were on with a critical eye to whether or not we could do more. We also had the benefit at that time of a bequest. And so in that time period, we did 2 things. We upgraded the windows in the church education building, replacing all of the windows with higher quality windows. But the most important thing is we installed a solar electric system. And it was the result of the bequest, plus the right thing to do in order to get us reduction in costs on an ongoing basis and an improvement in our environmental footprint. The solar electric system, as I'll talk about a little bit more, is rated for the full anticipated capacity that the church uses in terms of total electric energy in a year. So that's about 38,000 kilowatt hours. The system that we installed is capable of a 33% expansion. Now, why would we need to expand? If we ever replace our air conditioners with heat pumps, we'll be in a position to use electrical energy to supply our heat in winter. That may increase the demand or our total usage of electrical energy, and we may choose to expand. If we do so, we have some embedded capability already invested into our system to allow us to do that. And the other advantage at that time was we get a 30% savings on the installation cost from the federal government. That benefit no longer exists, though. Where's the church going? What do we need to do to get to a zero carbon footprint? We would need to replace our air conditioning units with heat pumps. That way we'll stop using natural gas as the primary means of heating in summer or in winter. We have 2 gas hot water heaters. Those also could be replaced with electric. That's a little more investment involved because we'd have to run the electrical lines in order to do that. And we may have to add solar arrays if required based upon the annual capacity. And I say if required because one of the other things that we would do if we needed to replace our air conditioning units is we'd probably downsize at the same time, recognizing there's excess capacity within those units. So it might very well be credible that in the process of downsizing, from air conditioners to heat pumps, downsizing the capacity, you may not need any additional electrical generating capacity. So this kind of traces our history here at the church, and I'm also showing you the annual amount of kilowatt hours we've used from St. George Power as a function of time. Back in 2018, we implemented controls on demand. We also completed some building upgrades, and you can kind of see the effect of that as we drop down. Of course, the pandemic hit, and we used very little energy during that time period because our buildings were closed down. In 2022, we had a fairly large amount, but when we looked down on that, it was because we had relaxed thermostat controls. So I can blame Eric for that.
Yeah, it was Eric's fault.
We restored those controls, and then in 2024, we installed solar, and we had a dramatic decrease. Right. This is pictures of the attic insulation in the sanctuary. I mentioned that sanctuary is very hard to get at. Whoever provided the insulation for the church when it was originally built knew that. And so you looked at the sanctuary, above that, and there was very little insulation. Afterwards, we corrected that situation.
Geez, Guy, if they charged us when that was built, if they charged us for insulation, that's fraud.
Amen to that.
I don't think you can go back and do anything about it.
Well, and the other thing to remember is that we added on to the sanctuary, and they didn't fix it when we added on to it in 1999.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what the duct ceilings look like. So here's before, and here's afterwards. So they applied kind of a mastic type of material to all of the joints to seal them, and that's part of the evidence of that. This was very surprising. When we got up into the attics and looked around, we found a couple of instances where the ductwork was physically separated. We were air conditioning our attics. obviously, we've gone back and fixed all of those points in the process. And here's some pictures of our solar electric system. Just to go back and talk about some of the fundamentals that went into the design of the system. First of all, we wanted to have sufficient power to offset our annual electrical energy use. That's about 38,000 kilowatt hours. And in fact, we are producing as much energy as we need. Now, we still have a bill to pay with our electrical supplier because obviously the solar system doesn't work at night. And so we draw energy from St. George Electrical Power during that time period. They also charge us something called a solar reliability charge.
For having solar.
Now, that's basically saying, hey, if it's cloudy, we're not generating electricity, St. George has to provide it to us. And so the solar system's not 100% reliable. We draw on St. George Power to compensate for that, and that costs St. George money. We have to pay that. We wanted to have the ability to do cost-effective expansion in the future should that need arise. Now, so you'll actually see that the yard that our solar panels is installed in has an awful lot of room in it. That room is for additional panels in the future. It was also important for us to anticipate that because there has to be an electrical cable that connects the yard to our central hub for electrical power, which is right outside of this building, just at the entrance to the narthex. And so there's a cable that goes underneath the parking lot on that side that connects to all of these solar panels. That cable has excess capacity in it, should we ever want to add additional panels in the yard. We didn't want to have to dig up that cable again.
How did they get it? Did they ditch it in?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we didn't have to trench. They actually paid for a ditch witch, and it was neat to watch.
It was actually cheaper too.
Really.
The ditch witch was cheaper than the trenching would have been.
And of course, the last objective we had is that we wanted the installation to not detract from the visual feel of the church. We really didn't want solar panels on the roofs of our facilities. Fortunately, we had the space to do that, and we had the additional funds that it took in order to allow us to do that.
And we hid it behind the shed.
And this is a screenshot of what the end phase plot shows for us over the course of the last year. And this is the typical type of pattern that you'll see between winter and summer. Obviously, we produce much more energy in our summer months through the solar system than in the winter due to it. But we produce more energy than we use, and we ended up saving at least $2,500 a year in energy costs from St. George. How can you apply this at your home? Know the general principles that guide efficiency in energy. Know your history at home. Take a look at the past 5 years, identify trends. Inspect your attics. It paid big dividends here at church. It paid dividends for me also at my home. Roof ventilation or attic ventilation is another essential element. You can request a free energy audit from your local gas provider. Perform periodic self-checks and maintenance on your high-vac units. perform professional checks periodically. And based upon all of that, take a look at what the biggest return for an investment would be for you. For me at my home, it was added insulation into the attic, and it was upgrading of the air conditioning units themselves. Other hints, we can all use whole house or ventilation, allowing the natural temperature differences between night and day to help us out. Consider the use of evaporative coolers. For a while I had one in my garage. Sorry. Many companies that deal with energy savings at your home will do free inspections. You can learn from that, but also beware that they're interested in selling you something. So you have to take some of their things at face value. Get competitive bids from multiple suppliers based on a written scope of work. We did that at the church. At each one of these phases, we went to at least 3 suppliers to make sure that our bids were all reasonable. We didn't often go with the low-cost bidder, though. We understood their history, etc., and selected the one that we thought would add the biggest value for us. And get recommendations for your neighbors. There's nothing like having personal experience. I'm also happy to help if any of you need any help in your homes. And so God loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. We have a duty as Christians to protect our world and his creation. What else can I say?
Well, thank you very much, guys. We all appreciate that Guy was here today, and just look for our little poster in the hall for our next lunch and learn. We're looking at possibly April 14th, speaker to be announced. So, thank you all for coming. Any other questions? Or, don't forget, if you want a goodie for the road, help yourself. Thanks again.
Thank you.